17 people dead in just 90 days in one tiny town, and they were all buried by the same family. A fire, but when a doctor noticed strange marks on their bodies, he pulled a thread that unraveled the darkest secret in Pennsylvania's history. Warning, this wasn't just a funeral home. It was a house of horrors. And what police found in the basement was so disturbing, they erased it from the records for 100 years. Welcome to Millbrook, Pennsylvania. Population? Barely 300. Peaceful farms, smiling neighbors, and a funeral parlor run by the beloved Harpe family. For over 20 years, they buried the town's dead with care and grace. Or so everyone thought. Fearful face, but in autumn 1823, things took a sinister turn. 17 people, healthy, active members of the community, suddenly dropped dead. No epidemic, no explanation, just one terrifying connection. Every single one was prepped for burial by Hartwell Funeral Parlor. Then, one day, a traveling physician came to town. During a routine inspection of the bodies, he noticed something strange. Tiny, uniform marks on their necks. Discoloration on their fingertips. Signs that didn't match natural death. Signs of tampering. Signs of struggle. He sent word to authorities. When they came knocking, the Hartwells didn't resist. They smiled. They said, "You're welcome to take a look around." That's when this small-town mystery turned into a nightmare. Beneath the parlor, in a stone-walled basement sealed behind a false door, they uncovered what would later be called the chamber. It wasn't a morgue. It was a setup of iron restraints, makeshift surgical tools, and blood-stained floors, jars with preserved organs, notes detailing experiments on live human subjects. The Hartwells, it turns out, weren't just preparing the dead. They were perfecting the process of dying. And the townspeople? They were the test subjects. Authorities tried to contain the scandal. They sealed the files. They told the town the deaths were natural. But whispers began. Fire people who had buried their loved ones at Hartwell started exhuming graves. Some found empty coffins. Others found bodies missing organs. The funeral home was shut down. The Hartwell family vanished without a trace. Some say they fled to Europe. Others believe they died in the very chamber they built. But here's the twist. No one was ever arrested. No one was ever charged. And to this day, the basement still exists, face screaming in fear. And here's the most terrifying part. The original blueprints of the Hartwell Funeral Parlor were found in a museum archive. In 1998, the chamber was real. The markings were documented. But the files? Still classified. Megaphone, if this dark true story gave you chills. Hit that subscribe button and smash the notification bell. Because we got even more twisted American mysteries coming your way. And tell us in the comments, which town or state should we investigate next? Because trust me, some secrets are still buried. And we're digging them up. In 1801, a man named Ezekiel Hartwell arrived in Millbrook, Pennsylvania, with a vision no one had dared dream before. He wasn't here to open a bakery. He wasn't here to farm. He came to build a business around the dead. He bought a massive stone house on the edge of town, and from its cold, echoing halls, he founded the region's very first funeral parlor. Before that, families had to prepare their own dead, or hire the local carpenter to hammer together a crooked coffin. But Ezekiel changed that forever. At first, the townspeople were skeptical, suspicious. A man who made a living dressing corpses? But Ezekiel had something no one else did. Respect, precision, and compassion. He charged little, asked for less, and never turned away a family in grief. In just a few winters, he transformed from an outsider to the most trusted man in Millbrook. Ezekiel didn't work alone. He lived in that towering stone house with his wife Martha, their children Josiah, Caleb, and Rebecca, and Martha's aging father, Thomas Creed. From the outside, they were the picture of morality, attending church on Sundays, hosting barn raisings. Martha delivered fresh pies to grieving families. Even in the bitter snow, they seemed like the family you could trust, especially when you were at your most vulnerable. Josiah, the eldest son, was 26, quiet, intelligent, and meticulous. He had learned every step of embalming from his father. He was next in line. Caleb, just 23, was the muscle behind the scenes, digging graves, building boxes, hauling bodies. And Rebecca, only 19, was known for her soft voice and steady presence, holding hands with widows, comforting mothers, wiping tears. Together, they ran what many believed was the most compassionate business in the county. But compassion can wear a mask. The Hartwell Funeral Parlor was a 3-story stone fortress. The first floor, a strange blend of home and showroom. The parlor doubled as their living room and the place where bodies were laid out for final goodbyes. A narrow staircase twisted up to their bedrooms. But it was the staircase that led down that held the real secrets. In the basement, a dimly lit, tightly sealed chamber, they prepared the dead. Saws, tools, fluids, bleeding tables. At least, that's what the neighbors thought. Behind the house sat a large barn where coffins were built by hand. And tucked just beyond it, a small cemetery plot for those too poor to afford a grave anywhere else. But unlike most businesses, the Hartwells never turned anyone away. During brutal winters, when crops failed and children went hungry, the Hartwells still buried the dead. They accepted chickens, bread, firewood, and even future promises of labor in exchange for their services. Their generosity became legendary. Families owed them everything, and in return, they gave the Hartwells something far more powerful: blind trust. By 1823, the Hartwells weren't just undertakers. They were the gatekeepers of grief, handling almost every death within a 15-mile radius. Their reach was vast, their influence unchecked, but all around them, the world was changing. The Erie Canal was nearing completion, promising trade, transformation, and the roar of industrial machines, the whispers of factories, the shadow of smoke, new money, new people, and the fear that old traditions were about to collapse. In that moment, caught between the past and the coming storm, Millbrook placed its faith in a family that handled death with unmatched care, or so they thought, because while the world above buzzed with progress and dreams, something far darker was evolving beneath the floorboards of the Hartwell house. By 1823, everything in Millbrook was changing. Religious revivals were sweeping across Pennsylvania. Tent preachers, fiery sermons, screaming crowds. The old ways were dying, and small-town life was being ripped apart by new ideas. But in all the chaos, one institution stood untouched, unshaken: the Hartwell Funeral Parlor. To the community, the Hartwells were a rock, a symbol of order, tradition, stability. But under that calm, familiar surface, a storm was building. The Hartwells didn't just deal with death. They breathed it, dreamed it. They were surrounded by it, day after day, night after night. And over time, something inside their house shifted: the isolation, the trust, the total control over the dead. It created a dark temptation. And soon, the line between burying the dead and making them dead would be crossed, in the most horrifying way. It all began on October 15th, 1823. The air was sharp, the leaves were falling, and Dr. Samuel Harrison arrived in Millbrook. He was no ordinary doctor. He was a state physician, sent to rural towns to inspect for diseases, unsanitary practices, and unusual burial activity. His visits were routine, his reports dry, forgettable, until this one. What first caught his attention wasn't how many people had died recently. It was how quiet everyone was about it. No rumors, no concern, just funerals, lots of funerals. According to Pennsylvania law, all funeral homes had to present bodies for inspection upon request, a law born from past cholera outbreaks, and one the Hartwells couldn't refuse. When Dr. Harrison arrived at their stone mansion, he was met with warm smiles. Ezekiel Hartwell and his son Josiah greeted him personally, polite, respectful, too perfect. They gave him a full tour. Pristine preparation rooms, modern embalming tools, not a speck of dust in sight, but it was all surface. Because when Harrison asked to examine 3 bodies currently awaiting burial, the temperature in the room dropped. The first body was Ellen Fairchild, 68 years old, a widow, dead just 3 days. Cause of death, consumption. As Dr. Harrison rolled back the sheet and began his inspection, he froze. His eyes locked onto something so subtle, so small, but so deeply wrong. Tiny symmetrical marks, just below the jawline. Fresh, not consistent with tuberculosis. And then bruising around the wrists. Faint, but undeniable. This woman didn't go peacefully, and Dr. Harrison knew it. In that single moment, everything he thought he knew about the Hartwells collapsed. This wasn't about sloppy embalming. This wasn't about outdated methods. This was something darker, and he had 2 more bodies to go. Dr. Harrison leaned closer, adjusting the collar of Ellen Fairchild's burial gown. What he saw beneath chilled him to bone. Bruises. On her neck. Faint, but unmistakable. The pattern wasn't from illness. It wasn't random. It was deliberate. Manual strangulation. This wasn't a woman who faded away from disease. This was a woman who fought for her life. When questioned, Josiah Hartwell didn't miss a beat. He blamed the bruising on the embalming process. She slipped, he said. Her head tilted awkwardly, he claimed. The words made sense, but his voice didn't. It trembled, just barely, and his eyes, darting unfocused, never met Harrison's. That was enough. Harrison moved to the second body. Marcus Webb, age 42, strong, healthy, dead of sudden heart attack, allegedly. But when Harrison pulled back the linen sheet, something didn't add up. Tiny, precise punctures on the arms, on the chest, evenly spaced, deliberate, not scratches, not random trauma, not the result of a fall. Ezekiel stepped forward with another quick answer. Webb had collapsed onto farming tools in his field. But these wounds, they were surgical, as if someone had inserted something on purpose. The third body was a final blow. Mary Patterson, only 26, a mother of 2, dead from fever, they said, a brief, sudden illness. But as Harrison examined her fingers and lips, white powder, dusty traces under the nails, around the mouth, faint but there, and Harrison's medical training recognized it instantly. Arsenic. It was common in barns and root cellars, used to kill rats, but it had just killed a young mother. Harrison stood frozen. All 3 deaths, supposedly natural. All 3 covered in signs of deliberate harm, and all 3 resting peacefully in the care of the Hartwells. But now, the mask of hospitality was gone. The warm smiles had disappeared. The air in the house turned heavy, thick with unspoken dread. In the kitchen doorway, Martha Hartwell stood, holding a tray of tea, but her face wasn't motherly. It was predatory. Rebecca, young and gentle just hours ago, now stared with cold, emotionless eyes, not innocence, but something darker, awareness. The family no longer played the part. They watched, they calculated, and still Harrison wasn't done. He demanded access to the basement, the embalming room. What he found confirmed everything. Along one wall, large glass containers. Inside them, murky fluids. And floating in the fluids, human organs, preserved, labeled, stashed like collectibles. Some were lungs, some hearts, others impossible to name. When questioned, Ezekiel gave one last answer. They're for education, he said. But in that moment, Harrison understood the truth. This wasn't education. It was obsession. And he was standing in the center of a carefully constructed nightmare. The organs in the glass containers, they weren't old. They weren't relics from forgotten cases. They were fresh, too fresh. And the way they were sliced, clean, methodical, surgical, wasn't meant for preservation. It was for study, or worse, experimentation. Then Dr. Harrison saw it. A leather-bound journal, half hidden under a stack of burial linens. He reached for it, but before his fingers could touch the cover, Caleb Hartwell stepped in, fast, blocking his view. "It's private family records," he muttered. But Harrison had already seen just enough. Names, addresses, health notes, financial details, a hit list disguised as client records, people in the town, their medical history, their debts, their vulnerabilities. Why would a funeral home track such things, unless they were choosing who would die next? The inspection ended, but the nightmare didn't. Dr. Harrison walked out of the Hartwell house with shaking hands and a pounding heart. He had evidence, but not enough. 3 suspicious deaths, a suspicious family, no confessions, no witnesses. And the Hartwells? They were saints in the eyes of Millbrook. He was just a visitor, a state official passing through. His word meant nothing without proof. That night, back at the Millbrook Inn, Harrison tried to write his report. But before he could finish, there was a knock at his door. Not the Hartwells, the townspeople. They had heard about his visit, and what they whispered in hushed voices shattered everything. They spoke of neighbors, strong, healthy, suddenly struck by illness and dead in days. They spoke of the Hartwells showing up before the doctor, always ready to help, always, too, prepared. They remembered the strange eagerness when death was near. One woman, Sarah Petton, told him the story that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Her mother was fine, just some joint pain. Then Martha Hartwell started visiting, bringing homemade soup, always comforting, always smiling. 3 days later, her mother was violently ill, too sick to speak, too weak to even scream. She died before a doctor could arrive. And the Hartwells? They offered free services. Immediately, that wasn't charity. It was cleanup. And suddenly, Harrison realized this wasn't 3 isolated cases. This was a pattern, a system, a silent machine of death. For over 2 decades, people had trusted the Hartwells with the dead, never realizing they might be delivering them. And now Harrison had stumbled into it, alone, in a town that believed in monsters wearing masks of mercy. But what he didn't know was that someone was already watching him. What if the friendliest family in your town, the ones who buried your grandparents, your cousins, your neighbors, turned out to be cold-blooded killers running a death lab in their basement? Because that's exactly what happened in the quiet town of Millbrook. It all started in 1801, when the Hartwells rolled into Millbrook, Pennsylvania. They claimed they were just humble funeral workers from Virginia. But here's the catch. They bought land from a dead man's estate in gold coins, and nobody knew where that gold came from. During their very first winter, a mysterious sickness swept through the town. 8 people died. Guess who prepared every single body? Yep, the Hartwell funeral parlor. Coincidence? That's what everyone thought. As the years ticked by, the townspeople started to whisper, why do people seem to die so fast once the Hartwells get involved? Why do they refuse second opinions? Why are they always in such a rush to bury the body? But the Hartwells? They were too kind, too helpful, too generous. So the suspicions? Buried, just like their victims. Then came the moment and no one saw coming. Dr. Harrison, a local inspector, went down to the funeral home's basement. Everything looked normal, but behind a false wall he missed was something straight out of a nightmare. A secret lab, filled with poisons, surgical tools far too advanced for a mortician, and detailed human anatomy. Sketches. This wasn't about funeral prep. This was science. Experimental, brutal science. Then came the final, terrifying clue. A leather-bound journal. Not just any journal. A death ledger. Every single person who had ever died under the Hartwells' care was listed, with notes like, hemlock too slow, arsenic dose adjusted, elderly with no family, ideal. This wasn't sloppy or impulsive. This was methodical murder, passed down to the family like a trade secret. Different handwriting, different eras, same bloodthirst. They didn't just kill, they perfected killing. And they picked victims no one would question, Lonely elders, drifters, the forgotten. The Hartwells had weaponized kindness. They used compassion as a cover. And their basement wasn't just a morgue. It was a slaughterhouse for the unsuspecting. Today, Millbrook looks like any other small town. Peaceful, quiet, but beneath its soil lie secrets. And victims who were never supposed to be found. So the next time someone's a little too eager to help at a funeral, you might want to ask one question. Are they burying the dead, or are they helping them get there? The Hartwells weren't just hiding in plain sight. They were thriving in it. They didn't wear masks. They didn't live in shadows. They were your neighbors, your friends, the ones who brought a casserole when your aunt passed away. But behind every smile was death. Their victims, chosen with chilling precision. Elderly, isolated, struggling. People no one would question disappearing. These weren't random killings. This was a well-oiled machine operating with cold mathematical precision. Every death, a calculated risk. Every selection, a strategic move. They spread the killings out, just enough to avoid suspicion, just enough to stay invisible. But then came the Marcus Webb entry, and this one will chill your blood. Marcus Webb was a quiet widower. No kids, no siblings, just an aging man living next to the Hartwell. Property. He never saw it coming. Josiah Hartwell, the methodical son, wrote every detail like a twisted scientist. Subject identified. Marcus Webb. Condition ideal. No relatives. Convenient proximity for disposal. They invited him over. Said they wanted to discuss a coffin for a neighbor. A coffin. Once he stepped through that door, it was already over. They restrained him. Quietly. Efficiently. Without struggle. What followed was not an execution. It was an experiment. Pain was recorded. Fear was measured. Dosages tested. All for one ultimate goal. Mastery over death. They faked a heart attack. Staged it flawlessly. He was buried within 24 hours. The town mourned him. The Hartwells organized a funeral. The predators buried their prey, and nobody knew. And it wasn't just Marcus. It never was just one. They took cash, valuables, farm deeds, but it was never about the money. That was just a perk. They were obsessed with the act itself, the unraveling of life, the reactions, the silence before death. One journal entry broke it down like a lab report. Different poisons, different ages, different conditions. They weren't killing people. They were running trials. And at the center of this human experiment was Martha Hartwell, the smiling matron of Millbrook, the one who brought homemade pies to the sick. But those pies, they killed. Martha had mastered the art of slow poisoning. She'd win trust, earn affection, then serve the final meal. No one suspected her. Who could? She looked like every kind neighbor your grandma trusted. But it didn't stop there. It was a family tradition. The children were raised not with lullabies, but with instructions. Who looked lonely? Who was limping? Who coughed during service? Rebecca, the youngest, became a master at spotting targets during church. Potlucks. She'd report back like a soldier. Names. Details. Weaknesses. The sons? Experts in force and staging. They could make a murder look like an accident faster than the coroner could write natural causes. But what truly made them terrifying was their double life. Sunday morning, church pews, warm smiles. Sunday evening, poison blades, deception. They didn't hide from the community. They were the community. They voted. They donated. They grieved. Sometimes at the very funerals they orchestrated. This wasn't a family. This was an empire of death wearing the mask of decency. And the scariest part? They weren't done yet. In the cold, cruel autumn of 1823, everything changed. The Hartwell family, already known for their kindness, doubled down on evil. Families were desperate, starving, alone, and the Hartwells, they swooped in like saviors, while plotting their next victims with military precision. But here's the twist. They weren't just after money. They wanted control, experiments, and a front row seat to human suffering. Their methods? Cold, calculated, untraceable. And then Dr. Harrison arrived. Harrison was no ordinary physician. His mission? Inspect a funeral home. Just routine work. But what he found inside shook him to the core. Poison in the veins. Wounds that didn't match the cause of death. These weren't accidents. They were blueprints for murder. But here's the craziest part. He couldn't tell anyone. Why? Because the Hartwells were beloved saints in the town. Accusing them would be like accusing your grandma of setting houses on fire. And in just 48 hours, Harrison was scheduled to leave town. Tick, tock. Just when it seemed all hope was lost, enter Thomas Creed, an old man with a trembling voice, claiming stomach pain. He asked to meet Harrison in secret, not at the clinic, not at the inn, in the dark, cold stable behind the tavern. And what happened there was insane. Creed's mask dropped. No longer a weak old man, but a terrified survivor with a warning. Doctor, I know what you saw, and I know what they did to me. He wasn't sick by chance. He was being poisoned by his own family. Not once, not twice, over months. He was their test subject. His age made him perfect for their twisted science experiments. They watched how long he'd last, how much pain he could take, all while smiling at church, serving tea, hugging neighbors. And that night, in the candlelight haze of the stable, Creed spilled everything. Names, methods, victims, confirming every one of Harrison's darkest fears. And then some. Now the doctor had a choice. Run, report, or risk being next. The clock was ticking. The town still blind. And the Hartwells still smiling. So what would you do if you had 48 hours to expose a serial killer family while being hunted by the very people you're trying to save others from? Stay tuned, because this story only gets darker from here. Creed had been silent for years, but now, with his life hanging by a thread, he unleashed a truth that would rip Millbrook's trust apart. It all began with grave robbing, fresh bodies, stolen jewelry, gold teeth, clothes sold in other towns. But greed doesn't stop, and in 1807, everything changed. They accidentally killed a sick man they were looting, and the town didn't suspect a thing. No one questioned the death, not even his family. That moment, fire that was the birth of a machine that murdered in silence. Fire. Over time, they perfected the craft. Each family member had a role, a specialty in death. Poisoning, torture, suffocation, fake illnesses. They turned the funeral home into a factory of corpses, and the basement, a blood-stained archive of 40-plus human lives, charted, dissected, and discarded like merchandise. They built a network across towns. Spies, informants. They targeted loners, travelers, people no one would miss. And if the body couldn't pass as natural, it went into the woods. Yes, there was a mass grave behind their home. At least a dozen souls dumped like trash. Some were just strangers asking for directions who never made it out alive. So why believe Creed? Because he knew details no one else could. He described every horrific method. How Ella Lenina was strangled in silence. How Marcus screamed under torment before dying. How Mary was poisoned day by day while being nursed by her killer. Creed didn't just talk. He lived it. And he had the ultimate key. Access to the secret basement, the records, the tools, the truth. But why betray his family? Because he was next. They were done with him. His usefulness? Over. His fate? To become the next specimen. So Creed made a final move. A desperate deal with Dr. Harrison, the town physician who was already suspicious. Creed handed over the basement key and laid out a do-or-die plan. During Sunday church, while the family was gone, Harrison would sneak into the house, unlock the lab, gather proof, and vanish. Creed would flee to Philadelphia before anyone noticed he was gone. But the stakes? Colossal. One wrong move, and both men would vanish into that mass grave. Harrison didn't sleep that night. He paced his tiny inn room, haunted by every corpse he'd touched, every autopsy scar that suddenly made sense. He held that key in his hand, cold, rusted, heavy. If this plan worked, they'd save lives. If it failed, they'd become the next chapter in the ledger of the dead. Sunday morning came, gray, bitter, bone-deep cold. The townspeople dressed for church, smiling at each other like nothing was wrong, completely unaware of the darkness living among them. Meanwhile, in a room above the inn's tavern, Dr. Harrison braced himself. Outside, the Hartwell family laughed, locked their doors, and headed to worship. Inside, the clock started ticking. He had exactly 47 minutes to uncover a family's monstrous secret before they came home. The weight of truth bore down on Dr. Harrison like a millstone. Every breath he took felt heavier, burdened not only by the knowledge of the Hartwell's sins, but by the growing certainty that his own life now teetered on the edge. Thomas Creed's final act had been one of desperate redemption. The old man, ravaged by guilt and age, had passed him a small, ornate key, an artifact as delicate as it was damning. With it came a set of chilling instructions. Enter the Hartwell basement during the family's absence at church. Their ritual never faltered. As staunch Methodists, they remained at Sunday services well into the afternoon, mingling with neighbors, projecting their pristine image of virtue. That brief window, Creed insisted, was the only time. The house would be unguarded. The basement had more than dust and decay. Behind a cold stone wall lay a concealed compartment, a tomb of secrets. There, according to Creed, rested a leather-bound murder journal, anatomical sketches, vials of exotic poisons, and preserved remains, the grotesque relics of experiments disguised as mercy. But most damning of all was a hand-drawn map marking the final resting places of the lost bodies, buried deep in unmarked earth, their deaths hidden beneath years of ceremony and silence. As the distant bells of Millbrook began their mournful chime, Dr. Harrison waited in the shadowed tree, lying behind the Hartwell estate. The family emerged like actors on stage, dressed for reverence. Ezekiel, solemn and black, wore the bearing of a minister. Martha's dark blue gown and prim white collar gave her the air of maternal piety. Josiah and Caleb walked with purpose, flanking their parents like sentinels. And then Rebecca, young, graceful, eyes downcast, embodied innocence so completely it chilled him. But Harrison now saw the facade, the two perfect smiles, the ease with which they greeted neighbors, the warmth they feigned with children, a family of devout respectability, built upon the bones of the forgotten. He waited half an hour, then approached. The funeral home loomed in silence, its stone exterior weathered by time and stained by unseen suffering. It did not welcome him. It warned him. Yet he pressed forward, heart racing beneath the weight of his. Physician's calm. The key slid into the lock with a finality that echoed in stillness. The door creaked, open, breathing out the chill of the underground. And with that he descended, not just into the Hartwell's basement, but into the depths of a horror that had festered in the heart of Millbrook for far too long. Methodically, Dr. Harrison stepped deeper into the abyss. At first glance, the basement betrayed nothing. Everything appeared exactly as it had during his official inspection. Pristine embalming tables, shelves lined with meticulously labeled chemical solutions, and the bodies, 3 of them, resting beneath crisp white sheets, their forms serene in the still air. It was the perfect picture of professional dignity, the kind one might find in a medical brochure or a textbook on mortuary science. But perfection, he had learned, is often a mask for rot. He moved slowly, eyes scanning the stone walls as Creed had instructed, fingers brushing against the seams between blocks. Then there, a faint groove just slightly out of line. His breath caught. The key trembled slightly as he raised it, metal meeting stone with a soft click. A section of the wall gave way, sliding inward on silent hinges. What lay beyond was no longer the realm of professional decorum. The hidden chamber stretched far beyond the footprint of the funeral home, tunneling deep into the hillside, carved with purpose and care. Cold, dry air greeted him. Rows upon rows of shelves emerged. From the gloom, each bearing glass jars filled with preserved human organs, hundreds of them, each jar meticulously labeled with handwritten tags, names, dates, anatomical terms, and notes in variety of hands. This wasn't just murder. It was study, documentation, obsession. At the room's center stood a wooden lectern, aged and carved with family crest he now recognized. The Hartwell emblem. Atop it sat the murder journal, its leather cover worn and cracked, the edges of its pages stained with age or something darker. He opened it. The handwriting varied, but the tone remained eerily consistent, cold, clinical, devoid of remorse. Page after page chronicled death with surgeon's eye and scientist's detachment. Victim, approach, method, reaction, conclusion. Some entries were brief, a quiet poisoning. Others were extensive, diagrammed, and annotated like a doctoral thesis on human suffering. They had started simply, arsenic, belladonna, laudanum, but over time the experiments evolved. Techniques grew more invasive, more experimental. Recent entries described incisions made while the victim still breathed, just to observe the response of the nervous system in situ. Others recorded organ failure times post-exposure to rare toxins, some imported from Europe, others cultivated in their own garden. It wasn't just a horror of the acts themselves that sickened him. It was the precision, the pride. And then he turned to the maps. Folded between two pages, he found hand-sketched layouts of other towns. Harrisburg, Reading, Carlisle, Lancaster, all familiar names, all marked with red XS. Each town a different target, a different funeral, a different victim. It became clear they had perfected a traveling system of murder, disguised as mercy, concealed beneath religious ritual and the noble pretense of service. But nothing prepared him for the anatomical drawings, pinned to the far wall, some yellow with age, others disturbingly recent. They portrayed human bodies, peeled back with artistic precision, muscles rendered in ink and charcoal, nerve clusters labeled in Latin, notes scrawled beneath, subject survived 8 minutes post-extraction. Hypoxia onset at 3:42. Try through the clavicular route next time. He stood in silence, surrounded by the unholy union of medicine and murder. And in that moment, Dr. Harrison realized the Hartwells were not simply killers. They were pioneers of pain, explorers of agony, engineers of slow and sacred death. Imagine stepping into what looks like a normal funeral home basement and stumbling upon a chamber, straight out of your worst nightmare. But this isn't fiction. This is real. And Dr. Harrison? He's already in way too deep. Beneath the surface of Millbrook's quiet town, behind a fake stone wall, Dr. Harrison unlocked a horror that had been hidden for decades, a secret room larger than the house itself. Shelves groaned under the weight of hundreds of preserved human organs, each jar labeled, each label detailed. And in the center, a leather-bound murder journal that made serial killers look like amateurs. Every page was a blueprint for human experimentation. Which method made the victim scream the longest? Which poison gave them 10 minutes of agony instead of 5? How do children react differently from adults? This wasn't just murder. This was research. Cold, calculated. The Hartwell family had turned death into science. Victims weren't people. They were test subjects. And the family? They were surgeons of suffering. Anatomical drawings showed precise incisions, organ extractions, live dissection, all documented like a lab report. Even worse, the notes were in multiple handwriting styles, meaning generations of killers had contributed to this grotesque family legacy. But suddenly, footsteps, voices. Someone was outside. Dr. Harrison checked his pocket watch. 2 hours. He'd been in the basement 2 hours. And now he heard the distinct voice of Ezekiel Hartwell. They were back. Early. The front porch creaked. The floorboards above him groaned. And that's when Dr. Harrison realized he was trapped with evidence that could expose the most horrifying secret in Pennsylvania's history, and the people who would kill to protect it were just feet away. The basement door? Blocked. The chamber? A tomb. Panic surged through him. His heart hammered louder than the creaking floor. He scanned the room for an exit, anything. And then he saw it. Behind a pile of dusty glass jars filled with lungs, hearts, eyes, a second door. Narrow, hidden, carved into the rock at the very edge of the chamber. No time to think. The voices were almost on top of him now. He grabbed his bag, dodged a lectern, and lunged into the dark tunnel. This wasn't just an escape. This was a descent. The passage was tighter than a coffin and reeked of damp stone and old blood. The walls were hand-chiseled, rough, and curved downward, leading not up to freedom, but deeper into the hillside. As Harrison disappeared into the darkness, the secret door clicked shut behind him, and the basement above filled with the footsteps of the Hartwell family. Unknowing that their secrets were now running for his life through a tunnel meant for no one to return. The next few steps would decide whether Dr. Harrison would live to expose a century of evil or become the next jar on the shelf. Police Scarlight warning. What you're about to hear is one of the most disturbing discoveries ever uncovered beneath an American home, and it almost cost a man his life. We left off with Dr. Harrison barely escaping the Hartwell's secret basement, but trust me, that was just the beginning. What he stumbled into next was something straight out of a nightmare. Collision the tunnel. Using only a flickering candle he grabbed from the lab, Dr. Harrison plunged deeper into the darkness, following a narrow, crumbling tunnel that snaked into the hillside like the veins of the dead. Every step echoed like a gunshot in a tomb. The walls were carved by hand. Years, maybe decades, of work. But where did it lead? Direct hit, the cavern revealed. And then it opened. The tunnel spilled into a massive underground cave. And what was inside? Not rock, not treasure, but something horrifying. Drop of blood, a charnel house. Bones. Everywhere, lining the shelves. Stacked in heaps. Some meticulously arranged like anatomical exhibits. Others, dumped like trash. Skull, the smell hit him first. It was rot, pure death. But Dr. Harrison, trained in medicine, fought the nausea, and as he scanned the cavern with shaking hands, one terrifying truth became clear. Face screaming in fear, the Hartwells had been killing for decades. Over 40 victims. Men, women, children. Every corner of the cavern told a different story. Some bodies were mutilated with clinical precision, victims of experimentation straight out of a madman's playbook. Others bore clean wounds, quick execution for profit. Scattered among the bodies, jewelry, watches, rings, coins still stained with blood. And then he saw them. Coat the trophies. Recent victims weren't just buried. They were displayed, clothing pinned to walls, jewelry laid out like museum exhibits. And the worst part? Brain, he recognized them. People he had examined himself. Locals, clients of the Hartwell family business. He realized the horrifying pattern. They weren't burying the dead. Police Scarlight, they were killing the living. Camera with flash, Dr. Harrison frantically documented everything. His notes, photos, diagrams. This was evidence that could put the Hartwells away forever. But then, cold-faced voices, faint at first, then louder, echoing through the tunnel behind him. Dr. Harrison, not friendly, not panicked, predatory. They had discovered his absence from the inn. They found the secret chamber. Now, they were hunting him. Direct hit the escape. Heart pounding, candle flickering. He sprinted deeper into the cavern, praying it connected to something, anything, just when it seemed like the cave would swallow him whole. Dashing away a gap, barely wide enough for a man to crawl through, he squeezed, twisted, scraped through, and burst out into the cold, damp woods above the Hartwell. Property. Evergreen tree, he was free. For now. But as he looked back, breath ragged, he saw the Hartwell family moving to the trees. Lanterns in hand, voices calm, deadly. Speech balloon, we know you're out here. Direct hit, this was no longer about truth. It was about survival. If you thought that was insane, just wait. In the next chapter, Dr. Harrison's daring escape leads to A. Discovery so shocking it will shake the entire town to its core. Dr. Harrison crouched silently among the brush, watching the figures below. The Hartwells moved like wolves, spreading across their property in a sweeping, strategic arc. Each step was deliberate, each glance rehearsed. This wasn't a frantic search of family concern for a missing guest. This was the grim precision of practiced killers reclaiming control of a breached secret. And in that moment, the final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. This had happened before. Others had come close, perhaps curious travelers, local officials, or grieving families asking too many questions, but they hadn't escaped. Their bones were likely among those piled in the cavern below. This wasn't just a family with a dark secret. It was a generation machine of murder perfected over decades and fueled by ritual, greed, and scientific obsession. Dr. Harrison turned from the hilltop and began the most dangerous journey of his life. With no belongings, no allies, and only a weathered medical bag packed with evidence, he slipped into the dense Pennsylvania wilderness. Every rustle behind him, every broken twig beneath his feet, sounded like a Hartwell closing in. He avoided roads, kept off paths, and slept beneath trees. It was days before he saw smoke from a distant chimney, proof that civilization and perhaps safety still existed. What he didn't know was that Thomas Creed never made it out. The old man had been intercepted before he could flee. The Hartwells had confronted him not with anger, but with quiet, clinical disappointment. And then they began the questioning. What followed was hours of methodical torture, during which Creed gave up every detail. Harrison's visit, the discovered journal, and his escape plan. That was all they needed. The Hartwells returned from church early, not by chance, but by design. Their search for Dr. Harrison was not to contain a panic, but to erase a witness. Yet something in Creed's confession had changed their course. For the first time in years, the Hartwells felt exposed, vulnerable. Their mask of respectability had cracked. But rather than risk confrontation or scandal, they chose a different path. They would vanish. Within days, the Hartwell property was sealed. Ezekiel claimed a sudden illness, and the family required urgent travel to Ohio. Neighbors were told the funeral home would remain closed for several months. Sympathy poured in, unaware of the true nature of the emergency. Behind closed doors, the family moved like shadows. The secret basement was emptied. Jars were packed or destroyed. The murder journal, anatomical sketches, and surgical tools all disappeared. The cave system would collapse in places, trapping dozens of bodies in eternal darkness. Even the air in the tunnels seemed to still, as if sighing relief or holding its breath until the family returned. But they wouldn't. By the time Dr. Harrison reached the authorities with his trembling hands and his grim evidence, the Hartwells were already gone, like smoke from an extinguished candle. And Millbrook, that quiet town nestled in the hills of Pennsylvania, was left to whisper about the kindly family who helped them bury their dead, never suspecting how many they had helped create. Just 3 days after a chilling escape, boom, the Hartwell family was gone, vanished. Poof, no goodbye, no warning, just an empty funeral home and a quiet town left in eerie silence. Meanwhile, Dr. Harrison, the man who had uncovered their nightmarish secrets, arrived in Philadelphia, bloodied, breathless, and carrying what could have been the most damning medical report of the century. But guess what? Nobody believed him. The authorities looked at him like he was the crazy one. A respected family doing that? In our state? Impossible. His voice trembled as he recounted what he saw. The underground tunnels, the sealed chamber, the bones, the silence of the town. But it wasn't enough. By the time investigators reached Millbrook, the scene had already been wiped. Evidence? Burned. Bodies? Buried. Secrets? Sealed away forever. They managed to recover a few remains from a collapsed cave system, but nowhere near enough to expose the full horror. And when they turned to the townspeople for answers, twist incoming. The town defended the Hartwells. They were angels. They helped bury our dead. They donated to the church. The same family that tortured, buried, and erased lives was being praised like saints. And what about Thomas Creed, the old man who tried to help Dr. Harrison escape? Gone. The Hartwells told everyone he was just a senile old man who got lost in the woods. But Harrison knew the truth. Creed had been tortured, betrayed, and silenced forever by his own blood. Search parties went out, but they found nothing. No coat, no footprints, not even bones. Dr. Harrison didn't stop. He couldn't, even as officials filed the case under inconclusive. Even as the state bureaucracy swallowed it whole, he kept going. He burned through his savings. He traveled from town to town, chasing whispers and shadows. And then, boom, another twist. In Ohio, 1824 and 1825, disappearances, suspicious deaths, familiar patterns, too familiar. It was like the Hartwells had picked up where they left off, just with new faces, new names, and a new town too naive to question anything. Harrison tried to alert local authorities, but he was always too late. By the time help arrived, the Hartwells had vanished again. Years passed. The memory of Millbrook faded into history, but not for Dr. Harrison. He never let it go. Not the caves, not the faces, not the screams in the dark. His story was buried in dusty files, marked as unproven. But deep down he knew the Hartwells were still out there, starting again, somewhere. And maybe they're still out there today, watching, waiting, planning their next family emergency. You think you know your neighbors? Think again. What if the friendly funeral home down the street was actually a front for decades of serial murder? And what if an old one believed the one man who figured it out until it was far too late? 3 days after a respected Philadelphia family vanished without a trace, Dr. Harrison stood alone, the only man who knew the truth. "They're gone," he whispered. And the cave, it's almost like it never existed. The Hartwells' funeral parlor stood completely abandoned. Empty rooms, sealed walls, no signs of struggle, no signs of life, just absence. But what really happened beneath that town was so twisted, authorities refused to believe it. A family, respected, loved, admired, was being accused of serial killings beneath their own home. And the only person trying to expose it, one doctor, against the entire town. Collision. When Dr. Harrison submitted his report to police, they laughed. They told him, no way a well-loved family like the Hartwells could be murderers. But what the cops didn't know was that most of the evidence had already been destroyed. Bombed the cave system beneath the parlor, collapsed. Bombed the bones, shattered and hidden. Bombed the witnesses, dead. And the last man who tried to expose them, Thomas Creed, gone without a trace. The town said he was just a senile old man who wandered off. Dr. Harrison knew better. They killed him. He knew too much. Faced screaming in fear, and just when you think it couldn't get darker, they got away with it. No arrests, no trial, no closure. The government filed the case away like it was just another cold lead. File folder, case inconclusive. Ice cube buried. Forgotten. But Dr. Harrison didn't stop. He turned from doctor to detective. His life, now a mission. He poured his savings into the hunt, following shadows, digging through death records. What he uncovered: horrifying. Police Scarlight similar murders. Police Scarlight identical methods. Police Scarlight different towns. Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Missouri. He was always one step too late, but always found the same pattern. A charming family, a funeral home, a string of natural deaths, then disappearances. Back in Millbrook, people were terrified. Some still said the Hartwells were innocent. Others started whispering, "Wait, my cousin didn't die of pneumonia. That was sudden. What if Grandma didn't just fall?" The Hartwell funeral home was sealed, its basement locked up forever. People avoided the building like it was cursed, because maybe it was. But the worst part? Millbrook changed. Forever. Locked, no more trust. Locked no more tight-knit community. Locked neighbors became strangers. Even death itself became a thing to fear, not grieve. Dr. Harrison kept moving, chasing ghost families. Every suspicious death, he investigated like a homicide. His colleagues called him paranoid. But he wasn't paranoid. He was right. And then, 24 years later, boom, the final twist. Love letter. A letter arrived from the Oregon Territory. A sheriff. A small town. A new funeral parlor. A new family. The Caldwells. Their story? Identical to the Hartwells. The same smiles. The same kindness. The same dark secrets. And suddenly, everything Dr. Harrison had spent his life chasing was real. I knew it, he shouted. 2 decades of being dismissed. Vindicated. But was it too late? Again? Authorities swarmed the Caldwell funeral home. And when they broke into the basement, they were not prepared for what they found. Buried beneath the foundation, the remains of at least 30 victims. But that was just the beginning. In a jaw-dropping twist, the documents recovered from the scene revealed a horrifying truth. The Caldwell family was actually the Hartwells. The same Hartwells that had vanished 2 decades earlier from Millbrook, Pennsylvania. The same family that had somehow evaded justice while murdering over 120 people across America. Every time suspicion arose, they moved west, changed names, blended in, set up a new respectable funeral parlor, and then started killing again. Ezekiel Hartwell, now calling himself Ezekiel Caldwell, was 73 years old when they finally caught him. But he was still sharp, cold, and completely unrepentant. And the worst part? He wasn't working alone. Martha, Josiah, Caleb, Rebecca, the entire Hartwell family had stayed together, murdering their way across the American frontier like some twisted family business. And when interrogated, they confessed everything. The poisonings, the fake burials, the strategic victim selection, the cover-ups. They called themselves entrepreneurs, except their business model was mass murder. Ezekiel Hartwell was hanged in Salem, Oregon, December 1847. His wife, Martha, and son Josiah were executed shortly after. Caleb got life, but pneumonia took him in 1852. Rebecca, claiming she was coerced, got 20 years, but died mysteriously in 1851. But the damage was done. Across every state they'd passed through, Indiana, Missouri, Pennsylvania, Illinois, families were now digging up the past, realizing that the kind-hearted funeral director they once trusted might have been the very man who killed their loved ones. The story sent shockwaves through the country. A single family had shattered the illusion of safety in small-town America, and the man who first uncovered it all, Dr. Harrison, now in his 70s, traveled across the continent to personally witness Ezekiel's execution, because for 24 years no one had believed him. But now the truth was undeniable. Evil can hide behind the most respectable faces, and sometimes the people we trust most are the ones we should fear the most. This wasn't just a murder case. It was a wake-up call for an entire nation. Don't judge someone by their reputation. Judge them by the trail they leave behind. Because even the most charming smile can hide the darkest secrets. For 20 long years, the quiet town of Millbrook unknowingly stood in the shadow of evil. What had once been a place of faith, neighborly trust, and simplicity was forever fractured by a discovery too horrifying to fully comprehend. After Dr. Harrison's shocking findings at the Hartwell funeral parlor, his warning spread, but always just a step too late. By the time authorities began piecing together the pattern, similar crimes had already taken root. Indiana, Illinois, Missouri, each echoing the grotesque blueprint of Millbrook. But justice remained, just out of reach. The killers had always moved faster than the law. As word spread, a deep rift settled over Millbrook. Families who had lived side by side for generations began to look upon each other with suspicion. Some clung to denial, unable to accept that the kind-hearted Hartwells could have been murderers. Others began recalling old deaths, unexplained and sudden, and wondered how many had been staged, how many friends or relatives had met their end not by fate, but by deliberate hand. The once bustling Hartwell building stood empty, like a tomb left open. It was eventually sold and converted into a general store, but its past lingered like a curse. Locals avoided it. The basement was sealed forever. The hidden caves beneath remained unexplored, too dark, too haunted by what might still dwell within. What had begun as a local tragedy bled into the collective psyche of Millbrook. Death was no longer a natural transition. It became a looming specter. Neighbors kept to themselves. Children were warned not to trust too easily, and the faith that had once connected the townsfolk frayed until nothing remained but doubt. As for Dr. Harrison, the events in Millbrook never left him. He became a different man, methodical, paranoid. Every patient death, every small-town clinic visit was treated as an investigation. His colleagues mocked his obsession, but he had seen too much to be blind again. Then, in 1847, a letter arrived that rekindled the horror. A sheriff from the Oregon Territory described a family named Caldwell who had run a funeral parlor for 3 years. The pattern was unmistakable. Disappearances, suspicious deaths, sealed basements. It was Millbrook all over again. And then came the confrontation. After years of silence, one of the Hartwells was finally found and sentenced to hang. Dr. Harrison met with him in the final hours. Hartwell showed no remorse, only surprise that Harrison had survived. He casually admitted that other investigators had been less fortunate. And then with eerie calm, he dropped a final bombshell. There were others, trained apprentices, families across America carrying forward the same legacy, hidden in plain sight. He refused to say where. He took their names to the grave. Dr. Harrison died in 1853, but not before documenting every chilling detail of the Hartwell affair. His notes, buried deep in federal archives, stand today as forgotten warning. The town of Millbrook, it faded into obscurity. By 1860, it was abandoned, overgrown by forest, swallowed by time. But its legacy remains, a case study in how evil can with a face of trust. The Hartwell family didn't just murder individuals. They murdered a way of life. They shattered the illusion that communities were safe just because they were small. They taught America that evil doesn't always arrive with horns and fire. It sometimes comes with a warm smile, a respected name, and an open door. And so we ask, was everything truly uncovered? Or did the Hartwells leave behind secrets too dark, too monstrous to ever see the light? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Have stories like this haunted the past of your own hometown? If this story chilled you to the bone, subscribe for more tales pulled from the darkest corners of history. And remember, sometimes the real monsters are the ones we never suspected.